In this unit, we'll be focusing on some central themes of economics that we'll be exploring throughout the year. An economic system is comprised of many elements that direct resources and behaviors in a society. It is the laws, traditions, institutions, and mechanisms that are combined to allocate resources and distribute outputs. In other words, an economic system is what addresses the basic economic questions of what outputs to produce, how to produce the outputs, and who gets to consume those outputs. And an economic system is comprised of many different allocation and distribution mechanisms. For example, several mechanisms are used to answer the question, who gets a seat in your economics class? To begin with, society has to deem education desirable and to choose to devote resources to the production of higher education. Once the education is available, who gets to consume it must be addressed. Many decision-making mechanisms are employed to answer this question. There is a set of criteria that must be met before a student is admitted to college, such as completing high school and taking college entrance exams. Once satisfactorily met, a student must enroll for classes. Enrolling may be based on a priority system to enroll on a first-come, first-served basis. The student then must have a way to pay for the class in order to keep the seat. The process of allocating just one seat in an economics class has several layers and can be fairly complicated. Attempting to allocate resources and distribute output efficiently in an economy as large as the United States can seem impossible. The U.S. produces and consumes more than 25% of the world's output, about $12 trillion worth, but comprises only about 5% of the world's population. Society has to have some way of directing production. When discussing free market versus command economy in a history or government class, you may have discussed some of these features, such as a command economy having government officials decide market interactions. A command economy may work well in that it's a very simplistic economy. There's very little variety in terms of goods and services, but it can lead to adverse conditions as choices are limited and freedom is reduced. Whereas market-directed economy adjusts itself without the guiding hand of government, where price is a value measure of market interactions, so that choice and freedom are made more feasible and more achievable. Capitalism is an economic system in which resources are privately owned and discussions about how to use the resources are made by individuals and firms. In a capitalist or market economy, there is private property and decentralized decision-making. Those who own resources make decisions in pursuit of their own self-interest because as resource owners, they get to keep the proceeds from the sale of their resources or from the sale of the output produced by their resources. A market system is based on voluntary exchange and incentives to exchange. The existence of incentives means that people are motivated through self-interest to make efficient choices as producers and consumers, and are very likely to put their resources to the highest valued use. In a command or socialist economy, government owns or controls most resources and uses central planning to decide how to allocate those resources. Rather than relying on incentives, central planners direct resources to certain lines of production and decide who gets the output. In theory, government planners seek to use society's resources to produce the goods and services that members of society need most. Many of the specific objectives of a socialist or communist economy were outlined in the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and published in 1848, which we will be reading this year. Currently, many formerly communist nations, often referred to as a transitional economy, are moving from government ownership of resources and centralized decision-making to economies characterized by private ownership of resources and decentralized decision-making. In even the most extreme cases of pure capitalism or free market economies, it is necessary for governments to provide a legal framework so a market economy does not imply anarchy. Market-based incentives rely on government to define and protect property rights at the very least. There is very little incentive for someone to work hard to purchase a nice car if another can just steal the car without penalty. In the United States, most agree that the government does more than provide the legal framework necessary for capitalism to function, and we will be analyzing how and why governments intervene in a market economy through this course. The U.S. has an economic system that is commonly referred to as a mixed system because although markets play a dominant role and most resources are privately owned, the government has some control over resource allocation. Our choice of a mixed economy reflects a desire to protect some members of society from poverty and starvation. In addition, government frequently gets involved in economic decisions because of market failures, which are discussed in a later chapter, by enacting environmental regulations, providing for the national defense, and subsidizing health care and education. Before we go any further, we should probably define these two terms. A demerit good is a good that is in abundance in society, but it's not desired by society. So like cigarettes, for instance. A merit good is a good that is undersupplied, where quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. So in this instance, like healthcare services. So now that we've got these definitions out of the way of demerit and merit goods, let's explore and analyze the disadvantages of a free market economy. In a free market economy, demerit goods will be over-provided, driven by high prices and thus a high profit motive. For example, cigarettes, dipping tobacco, alcohol, and the rise of marijuana sales. Whereas another disadvantage of free market economics is that merit goods will be underprovided, since they will only be produced for those who can afford them and not for all stakeholders in the economy, such as education and healthcare. Other disadvantages of the free market economy is that resources may be used up too quickly, and the environment may be damaged by pollution, as firms seek to make high profits and to minimize their costs. Some members of society will not be able to look after themselves, such as orphans, the sick, and the long-term unemployed, and so therefore will struggle to survive. Large firms may grow and dominate industries, leading to high prices, a loss of efficiency, and excessive monopoly power. The disadvantages of a planned economy include total production, investment, trade, and consumption, even in a small economy, are too complicated to plan efficiently, and there will be misallocation of resources, shortages, and surpluses. A great example of this is the 10 million Ukrainians that starved to death under Stalin's regime when they reallocated wheat grains from Ukraine to Moscow, leaving a huge shortage of wheat in Ukraine, leading to the starvations. Because there is no price system in operation under a command economy, resources will not be used efficiently. Arbitrary decisions will not be able to make the best use of resources. Again, a planned economy is very much a top-down approach. Incentives tend to be distorted under a planned economy. Workers with guaranteed employment and managers who gain no share of profits are difficult to motivate, which is why many workers under Soviet Russia showed up to work drunk on vodka. Output and/or quality will suffer as a result. The dominance of the government may lead to a loss of personal liberty and freedom of choice. Do I need to point to specific examples of the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's Communist China, or Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in Cambodia? Governments may not share the same aims as the majority of the population, and yet, by power, may implement plans that are not popular or even corrupt. Another theme of economics is economic growth and economic development. We will focus more on these issues in the fourth section of our syllabus. However, economic growth is a long-term process that permits increased production of goods and services and improved material standards of living. In the production possibilities model, if you remember, economic growth requires an increase in the resources available for production, an increase in the technology used in production, or a combination of the two. The concept of development is a qualitative variable, and thus far broader than any of the variables aimed at describing it. It is above having choices. It's about having choices. Economic and political choices, choices of schools, healthcare, choices of government and your representatives. It is about having opportunities for education, opportunities for work and public office, private ownership of a firm or a house, and then leisure activities. It's about freedom, freedom of opinion, freedom of speech. More developed countries are MDCs versus lower developed countries is another major theme that we'll be discussing this year. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future is what we define as sustainable development. And so this is we can see this today in terms of green energy, going to solar panels and things like this, so that we don't use up all of our fossil fuels, which would diminish the energy resources for future generations. So what about economic growth in relation to the environment? There's many debates on this topic. Is environmental damage caused by economic growth? Due to an increase in income and consumption, do we really cause harm to the environment? Or is the environmental damage environmental damage quite often the result of the lack of economic growth? Such as increases in wealth means that there are sufficient resources to improve the method of production and lower pollution levels, use less material, and overall make more goods with less impact on resources. So, does economic growth cause pollution, or does economic growth help us create less polluting production processes? And the last concept we'll discuss is economic efficiency, which involves making the best use of resources and avoiding waste. In a free market system, this is decided in the margins between consumers and producers' sense of utility. Whereas in a planned economy, this is decided by either one person or a small group of elites that are then passed on to the rest of society.